Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Midwestern Marx Institute live broadcast. Got a special guest with me here today, Donald Corder of the Revolution Report. They just released a really awesome documentary called The Color Revolution Doctrine that I know a lot of you have watched. So I'm going to be asking him some questions about that today. We're going to be discussing color revolutions, the Tucker Carlson Putin interview, Russia, and geopolitics in general. So we'll get right into it after the intro. All right. Well, I want to start out by asking you about the Color Revolution Doctrine, this sort of documentary that you guys just put out. I know a lot of our audience was interested in it because I made a TikTok about it. And generally, when you make videos promoting other videos, trying to push people other places, they don't do that well. But that video actually got thousands of views, and people were really excited to watch the documentary. So it's obviously important information in there and information that people are interested in. So I want to ask, what was the impetus to make a documentary like that?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Eddie, for having me again on your stream, and thanks for PRing the documentary because yeah, it is really important. I mean, the impetus for making the documentary was actually pretty simple. I work at Russia Today for my day job, and last year in March, I got a call like in the middle of the night saying that Georgia was erupting into crazy violent protests, and I had to go there and cover what was going on. And usually when I have assignments like this, I think, okay, I'm going to take my camera with me and, do some independent journalism on the side for my own channel, my own website and everything. And I didn't initially think I was going to make a documentary, but after seeing what I saw in Tbilisi when these liberal protesters were wreaking havoc over there, it just kind of developed into something bigger than I had originally thought. Because for those of you who haven't seen the documentary, I mean, I have original footage from the attempted color revolution that happened in Georgia back in March of last year. I did interviews with some of these liberal protesters. I told them I was an American journalist, which, isn't entirely a lie. I mean, I am American and I am a journalist, but obviously their first impression was that I would be, liberal or something, or pro-Western. So they kind of trusted me and they showed me their true colors. In these interviews, people are saying that Russia's the souls of Russians are like possessed by the satanic forces, and this other guy talking about like the mongrel dogs of Russia. It's just these people are absolutely crazy. And when I was there, I was like wow, what causes this? I mean, oh, sorry, something fell. I was like, wow, what causes this? I mean, I knew that the U.S. sponsored color revolutions around the world, but I really wanted to get to the bottom of what made Georgia, what filled the country with so many crazy liberals. And after digging, I found out that it's because of non-governmental organizations that, when Georgia became, when Georgia split from during the fall of the Soviet Union. The president of Georgia after that was the also, he was also the leader in the Soviet Union as well. And at some point he tried to liberalize. And one of the things he did was allow thousands of these Western-funded NGOs into the country, thinking that was going to make the country more, pluralistic, as all of these, post-Soviet and late Soviet leaders were trying to be, thinking that it was important to be like to have countries like Western bourgeois democracies. And what ended up just happening is that these NGOs began starting educational programs, which ended up being propaganda programs. They ended up doing all this work, all this grassroots political work to undermine the legitimacy of the state. And they were, by and large funded by the George Soros Foundation, actually. He played a big part in the Rose Revolution, which overthrew the late Soviet and post-Soviet leader and installed a pro-Western guy that made Georgia, liberalized Georgia and made Georgia a worse place to live in, which, is, the testament to that can be the fact that guy's now in jail in Georgia, and the ruling party is not pro-Western. They're actually pretty anti-imperialist. So, and then after learning more about the Georgian situation, I started reading about similar situations all over the world. And, you start to realize that this isn't a sort of, accidental thing. And it's not like the United States government funds revolutions when they happen spontaneously or anything like that. This is why I decided to call the video "The American Color Revolution Doctrine," because it's really a doctrine. Like any country that the United States that has politics that the United States is not happy with, they're going to get targeted by all of these non-governmental organizations that are actually receiving funding from the State Department, and they will go into that country and basically, brainwash people. That's the main thing. I mean, their whole goal is to plant the seeds for a pro-Western revolution by changing people's minds, by opening all these programs that on the surface they don't feel political. They have feel good names and aims, like educating the people, supporting democracy, supporting job developments, career developments, all of these kinds of neutral terms, until these NGOs feel like they're strong enough to support some sort of revolution in the country. And to be honest, the craziest story that I read about that we include in the documentary was actually in Cuba. And this one was less about non-governmental organizations, but the main vehicle of this attempted counter-revolution was funded through, the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, these non-governmental organizations that do this kind of stuff. But they tried to overthrow the Cuban government using a social media platform called Zunzunio, which is basically a platform that they tried to model after Twitter. And they had a super concise plan. Their plan was to grow a following on completely non-political topics, to grow a following in Cuba based on attracting people to the platform with sports, with the weather, with super non-political news and entertainment and all this stuff. And then when they had a certain amount of followers, which I think was, if I remember correctly, 60,000 on the island, then they switch gears into anti-regime propaganda when they have enough followers. So all these people, they get attracted to this social media platform through seemingly innocent mechanisms. So they believe that they chose to follow this social media platform through their own volition, and they start to trust it because they use it more and more. And then once this trust is established between the user and the social media platform, then this social media platform changes gears, and the people who use this social media platform regularly and trust it, they go right along with it. And this is a very deceptive and sneaky way of manipulating people. But that's also the same thing. That's the same way it goes with non-governmental organizations in Georgia. I did an interview with Brian Berletic, who's an expert in Southeast Asia. I'm guessing it's the same over there. It's the same in Latin America, as you can see in the different examples I put in the video. So, yeah, that's kind of the impetus and explanation for why we created a documentary all about these color revolutions and why we called it the American Color Revolution Doctrine.
Yeah, the documentary was really great, and it's something that we need to be aware of nowadays because, like you said, the way that they pull this off is so nefarious. It's so because they pose as democratic revolutions, right? Or that's what the propaganda says, that these are democratic revolutions. Meanwhile, it's various U.S.-backed groups. In the case of the Ukrainian color revolution or coup in 2014, it was literally neo-Nazi groups. But the propaganda says, look at this great democratic revolution. Look at the masses rising up and taking power over their country. And USAID, I think, is one of the best examples of that in terms of an organization, because it sounds like it's aid. They say we're giving these countries foreign aid. Meanwhile, that organization is run by Samantha Power, an absolute demon who is one of the main people within the Obama administration pushing for the war in Libya and making up lies about Gaddafi to justify that war. And she's running USAID. And really what they do is funnel money into regime change efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if you go also on USAID's website, like they have a huge description page, and you read it and you wonder, like, what does this have to do with aid? Because a lot of it is about challenging like the influence of Russia and China and all this stuff. Like, what does that have to do with aid, giving aid to people?
All right. It's absurd, and there's so many places in the world that could use just material aid, but instead they're focused on countering China and countering Russia. And I like what you say about it being a doctrine, because I think it's important to point out to people, like, recently the U.S. signed another bill giving over $100 billion to Israel, to Ukraine, and to the military operations in the Red Sea against the Houthis. And people are shocked by this, and like, yeah, you should be disgusted by it, but you shouldn't be shocked. Like, this is how our system works. It's a capitalist, imperialist world system. Our government is not run by people who are thinking about the American people and what's best for them. It's run by bankers and oligarchs. It's run by the people who overthrew Iraq's government and Libya's government for oil and resources. So, we shouldn't be surprised when these things happen. They're a product of the capitalist system in its stage of imperialism, which I think is important to point out, make that theoretical point, because there are so many people who are disgusted by what they're seeing right now. But I think it's important to tie that back to a theoretical analysis of imperialism. And shameless self-plug of my reading guide for Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, that I recommend everybody read. But unless you have anything to say on that, I wanted to ask too, is there a difference between a color revolution and a coup? Like in your, or what would you define a color revolution as?
Well, I would say like a color revolution is a type of coup, because obviously a coup is just any, I would say, overthrow of the government done in a way outside of the norms of law. For example, what happened in, for example, Niger, that was a coup, but that wasn't a color revolution. And it was a progressive coup, actually. It was the military taking power after and expelling the externally imposed neo-colonial norms of law. So that's a good coup, I would say. But in terms of a color revolution, I would define that as a coup that is basically orchestrated and supported by the West using, I guess you could call them comprador forces within the country itself to overthrow a government that doesn't get with the imperialist program. That's really what we see across all of these color revolutions and attempted color revolutions. The reason why they want to have a color revolution in Georgia specifically is not even because it's not even because Georgia is anti-West or anything, because it's not actually. The Georgian government has been trying to maintain neutrality throughout this Russia-Western spat, but because the Ukrainians and the West are really eager to open up a second front against Russia through Georgia, the State Department has been pushing really hard for a color revolution there, even though the government there is not necessarily, pro-Russian, but they're accused of being pro-Russian by the protesters that are stoked on by these NGOs, and they just don't want to get, they don't want to take the West side. So that is enough of an offense for them to be a target of the American color revolution doctrine. Because just to give everyone who's watching a background as to why what was the spark for this color revolution in Georgia, it's that the parliament tried to pass a foreign agency law, which just required organizations that made over a certain percentage of their income from sources abroad to register in a foreign agency registry. And all these protesters were saying that this was like a Russian style law, that Georgia was becoming like Russia because Russia has a law like this as well. But there's no mention of the fact that, first of all, the first ever country to have a foreign agency law was the United States, back in the 40s, and then after that, a bunch of other countries adopted their own foreign agency laws. Hungary has a foreign agency law. Australia has a foreign agency law. The European Union is considering, adopting European Union-wide foreign agency laws. And Russia has a foreign agency law because, it's constantly the target of the American color revolution doctrine as well. And that's why we should also, think about the difference between the form and content of laws as well, right? A foreign agency law in its form is a foreign agency law, but its content depends on who's actually, enforcing a law like this and for what purposes. Russia, Georgia, Georgia, they had actually, under the pressure of the protesters, they ended up scrapping that law. But Russia, for example, has this law, and Georgia wanted to pass it because they're constantly the targets of these NGOs, Western-funded NGOs that are trying to overthrow the government. And I know we'll get to this a bit later, but you mentioned at the beginning of this stream we wanted to talk about the Tucker Putin interview. One of the things that Putin said in the interview, and this is common knowledge, is that the CIA is making no secret about the fact that it's trying to work with the Russian opposition to overthrow the government. And that was even before the SMO began. This has been the case for the longest time. And because of that, on top of that, the Russian government tried to be friends with the West for the longest time, And it's actually, I'm thinking of making another video or writing a book about this, but there's what I've understood living in Russia for 6 years and studying Soviet history for many more years than that, is that there's a period in Soviet/Russian history that I think could be aptly described as the era of naivete. It's when these late Soviet leaders and early Russian Federation leaders had this idea in their head that it was possible to be friends with the West. Some of them believed that some of them were in the Gorbachev camp, thinking we just have to not be like our Stalinist past, we have to be more universal human values, which I think is just nonsense. What ended up happening was that Gorbachev basically made concessions to the West without getting anything in return. And the people in power, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, were more than happy to accept these concessions without giving anything in return. But then you have the opposite side of this era of naivete, which are Yeltsin and early Putin years, not communists. These people, these leaders really believed that as long as, we're not communist anymore, we're bourgeois now, we can be friends, there's no problem. they really believed that the West disliked them because they were communist, when in reality, like it's almost like historical amnesia. Soviet Union had a Bolshevik movement that made the country communist because they wanted to defend themselves from the colonial Western pillaging of Russia that was already going on at that time. Communism was a way to defend Russia from colonial aggression. But that colonial aggression existed before even communists came to power, because that's just how capitalism works. In the capitalist system, there's the imperial core, and there's the periphery that's exploited. And it's crazy to me how how these Soviet leaders and post-Soviet leaders that grew up with the Soviet education system, they were so well educated, but I guess they stopped believing, like communist ideology. So they just thought that was nonsense. But reality hit them, especially Putin in the early 2000s, when he, as he mentioned in the interview, he talked to Clinton about joining NATO, and they were like, no, obviously not. Because like NATO, just because the Soviet Union stopped existing, it doesn't mean NATO stops being an aggressive imperialist organization that is meant to keep all competition from materializing outside of Western Europe. All that happened was that Russia became capitalist, and the imperialist core is like, okay, now you're going to join the ranks of the colonized, and Russia's like, no. So that's why we have the situation we have today. But I really think there's this period of just pure naivete in the Russian and late Soviet leadership that goes from like the mid 1980s to like the mid 2000s. And you could even say, I think also, that this naive attitude to the West in Russia was really only completely done away with when the military operation began, to be honest. In 2014, it took a big hit, like I think the Russian leaders were like, okay, we got to start, stop being so nice with the West. And then after they tried the Minsk protocols and that just didn't work, and then Angela Merkel and Poroshenko said they were just trying to buy time, that was when like the nail was in the coffin. Like I really don't think the Russian leadership has any illusions anymore about the West. But it's unfortunate it had to come to this.
Right. That's so interesting. It reminds me of that. It's a quote from Stalin or someone, one of the early Bolsheviks, and they're like, we read the theory directly. We read our Marx and our Lenin and our Engels, and then the next generation learned Lenin, Marx, and Engels, but they learned it secondhand. They didn't read it, and they didn't understand it as well. And, obviously by the time you get to Gorbachev, you have that lack of theoretical understanding that we were coincidentally talking about earlier, where they don't understand that, that capitalist imperialism is real. That's how the system works. And, the West isn't going to start being your friend and, helping you develop and cooperating with you just because you become bourgeois, as Putin said in that interview. Russia was like, we're bourgeois, like, now, why don't you want to get along? It's like, well, that's not what they ever wanted. They wanted you to be a third world country. They wanted, your resources and free access to your people's labor. And it's interesting. The Venezuela had the same sort of process after Chavez took power in 1998. He's slowly, coming to distrust the West more and more and more. And then in 2002, they try and oust him in a coup. And then in 2004, he declares the revolution socialist because he realizes, for one, I can't trust the West. And two, exactly what we're talking about, this is baked into the system. This is a result of capitalism. And capitalist imperialism. The West can't help themselves. Their politicians aren't rational actors. They're rational actors at the behest of corporations and at the behest of finance capital, right? They're not rational actors at the behest of the people, or even what's good for America, as Lenin points out in that book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. There's a chapter called The Decay of Imperialism, where he talks about how these imperialist countries overextend themselves and outsource their productive base and eventually begin to decay from the inside out, which I think is what we're seeing with the U.S. now.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think definitely the fall of the Soviet Union, gained imperialism quite a bit of lifespan, especially the fact that like parallel to that, the outsourcing of industrial jobs to the third world, allowing for super exploitation of labor, also I think significantly extended the lifespan of the imperialist system. But even that, it's kind of running its course in terms of profitability, even with the super exploitation of third world countries, I think. And again, another main thing that's putting a wrench in the gears of imperialism, I would say, is the military operation. Russia. I think that Russia is really at the forefront of the multipolar anti-imperialist struggle. Even though the leadership might not be politically as radical as China, for example, it has a communist party, but I think there's no doubt. And even Lukashenko recently met with Putin and said this, that Russia's doing the most right now, and is also suffering the most for to defend and develop this multipolar world that's emerged.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Carlos and I have this conversation all the time. Because if you look at like Russian foreign policy as compared to Chinese foreign policy, I mean, if you read Xi Jinping's The Governance of China, their foreign policy is based on the principle of complete non-interventionism, right? Which means they're not going to get involved in your country's politics, and that's fine, and we respect that. But by Russia sending troops to Syria, they saved maybe another Libya situation, where the central government is toppled and a bunch of terrorists take over, and you have a country where people are being sold into slavery, and it's just utter chaos. If Russia doesn't intervene in the so-called Syrian civil war, which was really a NATO and US-led regime change effort in Syria, that whole situation turns into maybe more of a disaster. So if you look at Russia's foreign policy even in comparison to China, they seem to be the ones really taking on the U.S. head on. I think people have to take into account Russia's history, like you said. They, had these years of becoming bourgeois and doing away with socialism, and not only was it disastrous for the working class and for the masses economically, but the West just tried to subjugate them. They didn't try and become partners or equals. They tried to turn Russia into a neo-colony. So, over 30 years later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, it's not the same country it was in 1990. They've learned, and they're less naive about the West. That's why I think that'd be such an interesting book if you did decide to write that, about that era of naivety.
Yeah, I would. I'm definitely thinking of doing that, or at least making like a long video about it, because there's something about like this late Soviet attitude that came after Brezhnev, pretty much. But I think a lot of it again has to do with like Western propaganda making its way into the Soviet Union, and also a loosening of the sort of ideological foundations that the Communist Party was supposed to be based on. And this also ties into the color revolution doctrine as well. Actually, one interesting thing I found during my research for this documentary was a fact sheet that was published actually by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, where they have their own research that they did in terms of color revolutions that were supported by the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID and stuff, going all the way back to the 1980s, like where. For example, the Solidarity Polish, capitalist trade union movement that was funded by USAID, actually, through funding through the obviously CIA supported AFL-CIO of the 1980s, and it was done through under the guise of like gathering donations from American workers who support like Polish workers fighting for freedom and everything. The fact that they were able to switch this, like that they were able to flip this narrative and turn a workers' union against a workers' state, and a very big one at that, just goes to show how effective the people running, or deploying the American Color Revolution doctrine, how adept they've become at understanding how to do things like that. Because the you know we saw the situation in Poland in terms of like Solidarity being marketed as an independent trade union, an independent trade union that was fighting the tyranny of the authoritarian government, and all the other trade unions that were part of the state were, nonsense that shouldn't be paid attention to. But in reality, nothing could have been farther from the truth, because Solidarity was not independent. The fact that it was getting money from the West, and obviously the West was entirely cheering it on. And these state-run trade unions that the capitalists and the liberals in the West say were no good, were ineffective, they were the ones that actually had like legislative power in society. Even they had actual control over the economy through the national plan, in which trade unions played. That they had like basically veto power over economic decisions that they felt didn't favor the conditions of workers. Like those were what state unions were able to do in the Eastern European and Soviet economy at the time. That actually exerted much more power over society than any sort of independent trade union, or trade union that's actually supported by the West. Just goes to show there's actually no such thing as an independent trade union, really. Just like there's not really any such thing, I think, about like sort of independent journalists either. I mean, like everyone's got a bias, and everyone's got even people who are journalists who don't get money from the state or from a big corporation or whatever. They're still actually beholden to the people that donate to them. So everyone's got some sponsors that they're responsible to, and obviously it's just important to understand what that bias is, and sometimes it's okay. I think it's really cool to be a journalist who receives donations from various people and is able to make their living like that. They're still biased to their constituency, but that's okay. I also think it's fine to understand if one media outlet has like a Russian bias, or another media outlet has a Western liberal bias, and then people should collect information from both and then draw their own conclusions, I think, instead of believing that there's such thing as an independent entity, that doesn't have any sort of benefactors.
For sure. I mean, that's a flaw, or something you get a lot with the liberal worldview in general. They like to portray themselves as non-ideological or non-biased, like what doesn't exist. And people will accuse us of being biased for being Marxist. It's like, no, everybody has their biases. Everybody has an ideology. What we've done is examine the different ideologies and chosen the one that's in favor of feeding people and moving humanity forward and ending the wars. I mean, that's what I try and be biased towards. And obviously, I'm also biased towards the audience that funds us. Like you said, everybody is. And I haven't read it for a while, so I would have to go back and check. But if I remember correctly, in Naomi Klein's book, Shock Doctrine, she's like social democratic liberal, definitely not a Marxist. There's still like all this naivety when she's talking about the color revolution in Poland, basically saying, well, it was a democratic movement from the start. But then after the revolution, it was hijacked by the West, who, did this shock therapy. It's like, no, the Western NGOs who were there and who were funding the Solidarity Union in the first place, that was always their goal. Their goal was always color revolution. It's not like they were like, let's do democracy, and then they changed their mind halfway through. Which is, if I'd have to go back and reread that book, but I'm pretty sure has kind of a naive analysis. But what else was I going to say? Oh yeah. This is something that you said earlier that I just wanted to respond to. You got to wonder how many color revolutions has a country like Russia or a country like China stopped? How many have they actually shut down? How many have been attempted? And you made that point. You have to look at form versus content in like a foreign agency law. And I think the same thing applies to like intelligence agencies, right? We think of the CIA and the FBI are these horrible imperialist capitalist organizations in the U.S. But the Cuban intelligence agency is what thwarted a lot of the assassination attempts on Fidel. And it's what's thwarted a lot of these color revolution campaigns. So it's necessary for these countries who are trying to develop themselves in a world dominated by capitalist imperialism to take methods to defend themselves, to use the state to defend themselves. And going back to having a theoretical understanding of these things, I mean, one day when Ingalls was on his lunch break, he wrote a three-page book called On Authority that explains this perfectly, right? There's different kinds of ways that the state can be used, that authority can be used. It's used differently by socialist countries defending themselves from imperialism than it is by imperialist countries trying to overthrow them. So,
yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%.
right. And that's where you get people like too accusing these countries of being authoritarian. It's like, well, what does that mean? You know, are they wielding authority to bring people out of poverty and protect against imperialism? Are they wielding authority to crack down and suppress the working masses? But yeah, what in general, I know you've watched the Putin Tucker interview a couple of times. What did you think of it? How did you think Tucker did? Personally, I thought, you know, I would have preferred someone like Scott Ritter or someone like yourself sit down with Putin and ask him some of these questions because you guys have a deeper knowledge of Russian history. But I think for the average American, you know, Tucker asked some interesting questions that'll be really, really eye-opening for a lot of people.
Yeah, so it's the interview came out at 2 a.m. here in Moscow. So I was called into work to cover that, and I watched until 4 a.m. right when it came out, and I did some reports, and then I watched it a couple more times after that. Once again in English, and another time in Russian, just to make sure that it was important to me to understand how they translated the original from what Putin was saying as well. I agree. I think it would have been nice to have someone who had a better understanding of, Russian society and Russian history and everything. Because of the fact that Tucker Carlson, this is the first time he'd ever been in Moscow. He was obviously limited in terms of his understanding of the culture, the history, and thereby the kind of questions that he could ask. And it kind of became clear to me at the beginning, because he starts with this weird question. I don't know if he was, I still can't tell if he was joking or something, when he asked Putin about some time where Putin apparently said that Russia attacked Ukraine because they were afraid that the US was going to strike Russia, which I don't remember Putin ever saying that. And Putin also was like, I never said that. But Tucker Carlson apparently says he has a quote, but for some reason they never expanded on that. Anyway, I think on a whole, though, the interview was good because number one, the advantage of Tucker doing the interview is that he has a huge following. So first of all, the sort of message that Vladimir Putin wanted to get forward, in terms of the Russian position on things, was made available to a huge swath of the American population. I mean, within the first 2 hours, over 20 million people saw this interview. And that's only on X. That's not counting the release on Tucker's website or on any other platforms where it was available. So that's good. Second, I think it's really good that a lot of the stuff that Putin was able to talk about, like the fact that, and this is funny to me because Putin's actually been saying this for since the beginning of the conflict, that Russia's ready for peace negotiations. They want to have peace negotiations. They've been saying this for already 2 years. And I think probably for most Americans watching that, because of the information blockade of the mainstream media and how the mainstream media distorts the truth, I think that was probably the first time most Americans that were watching that actually heard that Russia wanted to have peace negotiations, even though Putin has been saying this for the longest time. And even though they even had peace negotiations with the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians were ready to sign a peace negotiation way back towards only a month or two after the beginning of the military operation. And Russia even, pulled its troops away from the northern front around Kiev as a sign of goodwill to make this peace agreement go forward. And then Boris Johnson shows up and convinces the Ukrainians to basically deceive the Russians and use it as an impetus to further their offensive. And like nobody, I don't think anyone in the West really knew about this story until they watched this interview. And I also saw it. I was actually in Istanbul when all that happened. I mean, I didn't see when Boris Johnson came, but I saw the negotiations and all of that go down. But it was like something that the mainstream media just didn't cover. And so it was cool that this interview was able to give Americans perspective on that. There's a lot of memes going around about how Putin started the interview with like 30 to 40 minutes of a history lesson. But I think it was necessary, first of all, because it's like, I feel like for most people in the West, Russia and Russian history is like something they know absolutely nothing about. So he really did have to start from the very beginning. But I do have like some issues with his historical explanation, because there's some things that I don't really agree with in terms of the way Vladimir Putin like frames the historical narrative around Ukraine. Like, first of all, he says that Lenin created Ukraine, that there was like an artificially created state, and it was the product of the Bolsheviks. Like, this doesn't even take into account that Soviet Ukraine was not the first Ukrainian state to exist. Actually, there was also like the People's Republic of Ukraine, which was a bourgeois republic that was located west of or east of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before the Soviet Union formed. And the communists formed their own sort of state in the eastern half of Ukraine and fought with the People's Republic of Ukraine. And only after that fight was over did Soviet Ukraine form. And there was also even a separate republic that incorporated Donbass. But the reason why they incorporated these two into a centralized Ukraine, there were or into the borders that we know as to be Soviet Ukraine. There's a lot of reasons, but the main one really was because Donbass had the industrial base that Western Ukraine was going to need if it was going to be able to defend itself from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, that were at that point still hostile to communism, and were posing a real threat to the young Soviet government, especially after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. They took huge amounts of land and they were ready to take more. Luckily, they didn't get to do that. But, Putin always blames Lenin and the Bolsheviks for making this decision to draw the borders of Ukraine the way they did, and also for allowing freedom of secession from the Soviet Union. Vladimir Putin blamed Lenin and the Bolsheviks for that in the interview, but we have to understand this border problem was never a problem until capitalism came into the region, because they had a unitary economy. There was no problem with people in Donbass being part of Soviet Ukraine or Soviet Russia or whatever. They were all one people. They had a unitary economy. And, this, like I said, this nobody was counting on the Soviet Union collapsing. If it didn't collapse, then everything would have been fine in that respect. I mean, obviously they had problems with the, people like neo-Nazis, even after the fall, even after World War II, Soviet Ukraine had a problem with neo-Nazis. But there was not this territorial dispute between Donbass and Western Ukraine, because, it was a completely different world. It was a communist country. You could go wherever you wanted around the Soviet Union. It didn't matter where you were from. So it's really, capitalism. It's really the fall of the Soviet Union that I think is really to blame for this entire problem. We can't chalk it down to what Lenin and the Bolsheviks did at that time. But on the whole, in terms of what Putin's explaining about the fact that Russia and Ukraine are basically fraternal peoples, and they're not as separate. They're not and the kind of separate nations that people in the West envision them to be, especially because there's like so much stuff that goes into it that it's really difficult for Westerners to understand anyway. Like just the name of Ukraine, Ukraina, it means it's like the meaning of it in Russian is like on the fringe, because it was a territory of Russia on the fringe of the country, but the people there were like they were of the same people as the Russian Empire, and the people who came to be known as Cossacks, they were they have their roots in the Russian Empire as well. So there's no way you can understand Ukrainian and Russian history separately. They have a completely common history, and that's a good thing that Putin was able to talk about. But again, he, like Slava just mentioned, I mean, in the chat, he did try to fit it to his nationalist narrative. But in terms of the other stuff that he talked about, like I think it was that he made fair points about the emergence of the multipolar world. He said that the minute the U.S. started trying to use the dollar as an economic weapon, actually, he said that this is what marked the beginning of the decline of the dollar, and we're seeing all these countries switch to oil trade in the yuan and local currencies and all this stuff. Putin even said that these economic changes that we're seeing right now that are leading to ditching of the dollar, it's not subjective. He specifically said it's objective. There's structural changes in the global economy. And he said, it's as objective as the fact that the sun's going to rise in the morning tomorrow. You can't do anything about it. You have to adapt. You have to figure out how you're going to adapt to it. And he said that what the West does is adapt by force. It uses its military. It uses sabotage, like with the Nord Stream pipeline. It uses the color revolution doctrine, like we were talking about at the beginning of this video, so that it tries to force the sun from rising, essentially. And so I thought that was an interesting point that Putin made it in the interview as well. And just giving the perspective on why Russia launched the military operation, the fact that the Minsk agreements were completely stepped all over by the West, which they even admitted they didn't have any interest in actually enforcing later on. He talked a bit about how, on the eve of the Russian military operation, what really pushed Russia to launch it in the first place is that Ukraine finally was like, we're not going to abide by these Minsk protocols. And they began to dramatically intensify their artillery bombardment of Donetsk and Lugansk, and they began preparing for an offensive. This was like it kind of reminds me of like the way people see the Korean War, right? Everyone says the North invaded the South, but nobody ever talks about the fact that the South was preparing, was already, orchestrating provocations across the border, and they had their own plans to attack the North. So the North was like, all right, well, we're going to reunify our country, because, again, it's like they're not equal in content, right? North Korea was not occupied by former Japanese colonial colonizers, as was the South. In Ukraine, Russia moved its troops in to liberate the people of Donetsk and Lugansk that voted to be independent from Ukraine after Nazis came to power. It's not like Russia just wanted to attack Ukraine. Like Putin said in the interview, Putin doesn't have aspirations to take over all of Ukraine. It was never said, and it was never declared to be a goal of the military operation. Nothing of the sort. Although, with the way Zelensky's going, unfortunately, and this is only going to be, only Kiev's going to be to blame, I think it's very possible that what's going to happen is that Ukraine is going to get cut into little pieces. But it won't be Russia taking the whole thing over. I think Poland will take chunks. There's even like parts that like Hungary lays claim to. That's a possibility too. And it'll all be justified not as like a land grab, but like as a preventing Russia from occupying the whole of Ukraine, But I mean, anyone who understands the history of that region understands that Poland and Ukraine are not historically allies. Like Poland throughout much of Ukraine's history was occupying and attacking Ukraine constantly. So it's there's always been trouble in paradise, you might say, in this current friendship between Poland, Ukraine, Hungary, everyone in that region.
That's super interesting. What I almost forgot that the Boris Johnson breaking up the peace deal thing happened. That was one of the things I was trying to hammer on TikTok with our coverage of this before we got banned for one of the like fifth or sixth times. But trying to explain to Americans that there was a peace agreement on the table and NATO sent Boris Johnson to break it up and keep the war going. Because it's just so absurd. You had all these liberals, waving Ukraine flags, and while we're aiding the destruction of Ukraine.
And I just want to add about that peace agreement. One of the things that Arestovich said, the former presidential advisor to Zelensky, after he was after he was, I think he was pushed out of the presidential administration, but he said that this was like one of the most generous peace offers that on Russia's part that he had ever seen, that has ever existed. Like the terms that Russia offered Ukraine were super generous.
Huh. It's unbelievable. Yeah, I like what you said, or I like your criticisms of Putin that you've made too, because I've made the similar ones. I tweeted once Putin should stop bad mouthing Marxism as much as he does and socialism as much as he does, because if the Soviet Union was still around, Russia wouldn't be in the current situation that they're in. And one of my friends who's in Russia responded and said, what do you mean? What do you mean the situation that Russia's in? Russia's doing better than America. And I agree in terms of investing in their people and investing in development and, in their foreign policy. What I meant was that Russia wouldn't have needed a special military operation if Ukraine was still socialist, if the Soviet Union had never collapsed. So I think that's an important point to make, that the real root cause of this is capitalism and the return of capitalism, which has been a theme that we've hit on multiple times throughout this stream. The importance of...
If the Soviet Union had never collapsed, there would be no NATO Estonia state, NATO Latvia state, NATO Lithuania state, NATO Poland state. Kazakhstan is really in danger of, it's on the fence right now. There's a lot of anti-Russian forces there. There would not be color revolutions happening in Georgia. Like none of this stuff would be happening.
Exactly. Right. And people say too, there were people who call themselves Marxist-Leninists and supporters of the Soviet Union who were condemning the SMO when it happened. It's like, do you think that the Soviet Union would have allowed the US and NATO to go into Ukraine and turn them into a Nazi state and do a coup? No, they would have launched a special military operation much earlier.
Yeah. Just when someone starts talking a little bit about liberalism, they would have launched a military operation like in Czechoslovakia,
Exactly. Yeah, well, are there any other topics you want to hit on? I guess we're approaching an hour here, but is there any questions in the chat that people have? Oh, I did see that Slava, our friend, mentioned the Holodomor and that it's a myth. But if it's a myth, Slava, how do you explain this? Or this? I always say that if the Holodomor was real, the Canadian government wouldn't have needed to pay for a Holodomor bus to go around convincing people that it's real.
I know, it's hilarious. That is really like a big lie. Holodomor, that's crazy, dude.
It is. There was just a movie recently too that came out like depicting the horror of the Holodomor. I can't remember what it was called, but
Blood Harvest or something like that, right? Yeah. But you know what? Thank you for bringing that up, because that reminds me of another thing I wanted to talk about the interview in terms of Western lies. Putin, the part of history that he explained that I liked the most was his assessment of World War II. because it just drives me nuts when people say that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was an example of the Soviet Union collaborating with the Nazis. Like, this is the biggest example of historical idiocy that I know of. And I love how Putin really, he calls a spade when he says, like, the Munich agreements that in the West they call appeasement was really collaboration with the Nazis, first of all. Because and another thing is that everyone says poor Poland, Poland is such a victim in World War II. Poland had a nationalist government that essentially was fascist along like Italian lines, right? They didn't want to like they weren't genocidal like the Nazis were, but they were basically like fascist, and they wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. And their plan was to sort of work together with Nazi Germany to accomplish that goal. But they got burned, and Nazi Germany betrayed them. And that to me doesn't make them victims. And another thing that is important to understand is that in the Munich agreements, when the Western powers collaborated with Nazi Germany, it wasn't only Germany that got part of Czechoslovakia. Nobody ever talks about the fact that Poland got a chunk as well in those agreements, which just goes to show how Poland is just not the good guy that liberal Western historians try to make them out to be. They're actually very sneaky, and they got burned trying to do it. And obviously, I'm talking about the nationalist government. There were tons of Polish communists also. Those people, but they essentially fled to the USSR when all this happened and joined the Red Army. But I thought that was really important to talk about, that Putin mentioned, and also the fact that, like, Stalin tried to form defense agreements with all of these Western powers before deciding to go with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because he was given no other choice. And that's not even to mention all the other non-aggression pacts that all the other Western countries made with Nazi Germany before the Soviet Union made it. So with all that clear historical information that it's nonsense to say that the Soviet Union collaborated with the Nazis, I don't understand how people still believe that narrative. Like, the only explanation is just pure ignorance,
Yeah, ignorance and sheer, mountains of propaganda, and doing what Marx says that liberals do in the German ideologies. They isolate events from their historical context in order to lie about them. So they'll say Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Look, the USSR signed an agreement with Nazi Germany here, and here's a video that we did responding to Michael Parenti. Explaining how the idea that the Soviets collaborated with the Nazis is a myth. And in fact, it was the other way around, as Putin was explaining and you were just explaining. It was the West who were appeasing and collaborating with Hitler, whereas the Soviet Union was onto him from the beginning. And then, as you said, Stalin had no other choice but to sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to try and keep peace. And eventually that didn't work. And then the Soviets dealt 80% of German casualties in the war and lost millions and millions and millions of people. So the idea that they appeased the Nazis is not only historically inaccurate, but it's disrespectful to the millions of people who died fighting fascism, the millions of Soviet citizens and communists who gave their lives to stop the Nazis. Now you have these, members of the Western ruling class who did actually appease the Nazis, accusing the Soviet Union, the people who fought fascism, of being the fascists. It's just trying to turn reality on its head for the sake of literally funding Nazis in Ukraine and convincing you that Russia's the Nazis for fighting them. It's like unreal how they try to turn reality on its head.
Right. I know. It's like you according to liberals, you become a Nazi for having the courage to become just as determined and, obviously in wartime, authoritarian, to challenge what the Nazi, like a war of annihilation that's being waged against your people. Like, obviously you're not going to be nice. You have to fight war with war,
Exactly. Right. Dibs on Stalin's Big Spoon for a band name. Thank you, Pub of the Dead, for the $5.
Stalin's Big Spoon. I would listen to that band. That's awesome.
I think our comrade Noah would like that. He likes dad jokes and rock bands, so I'm gonna have to let him know.
Nice.
Sure. Well, do you have anything else you want to discuss, or anything you wanted to plug? Obviously, the American Color Revolution Doctrine is out now. Check it out on the Revolution Report YouTube channel. I'll link it in the description and in the chat here one more time. But yeah, anything else that you guys got going on?
Yeah, comrades, you should check out our website, therevolutionreport.org, because we have a number of writers who write on news subjects from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, and we write some theory as well. So you can find interesting stuff on our website, definitely. And if you use Instagram, please follow us on Instagram, because like Eddie was saying before, Midwestern Marx is blocked on TikTok for making communist content. We were blocked on Instagram. We got up to past 2,000 followers, and then we got shut down. Now we're down to we're starting all over again at 69 people. So please follow us on Instagram.
Yes, please. I feel your pain. It's it sucks. We had 375,000 on our first TikTok.
Oh my God.
When that was when it got handed over to Project Texas, and a bunch of NATO operatives and national security agents took over TikTok US and just wiped out this giant community of socialists that we had. So.
Jesus.
So yeah, everyone check out the Revolution Report. Check out their YouTube as well. I've been enjoying your conversations with Alexander McKay, right? Is that who you've been talking to? Yeah, he's awesome.
Yeah.
So cool. Yeah. All right. Without further ado, got one more super chat. Thank you, ER Silva. Appreciate the $10 super chat. All our funding at the Institute comes from you guys. Which reminds me, I should plug our Patreon or Patreon, patreon.com/MidwesternMarx. Check it out. And with that, I think we'll head out and play the outro. So thank you for joining us, Don. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Eddie.
If I can find the outro.
Cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.